Now, back in those days in 1970 and 71, the mixer from one turntable to the second turntable was not created yet. You can look it up and see. It was not even made up. There was no knob mixer, there was no up and down mixer, there was no crossfade mixer in 1970. The only things that they had when at the radio stations, and I've been in WWRL and all of those, right, what they had was a switch. A switch would say A and B, and that would allow them to go from one record to the other. Now, in the radio days, where they had that, they didn't need two records because they weren't blending. So the person would talk and then put the record on. So if you look at the older things like Wolfman Jack and all of those records and Henderson and all of those, they had one turntable. So there was no mixer to do the knob and mixer to go from one turntable to the other. That's number one. When Herc started out, he started out with a mixer. And if I'm not mistaken, he had a crossfade mixer. So not even a up and down mixer, because the first mixer was a up and down mixer. The second mixer the first mixer was a knob mixer that turned a round knob. The second mixer was a up and down mixer. The third mixer was a crossfade mixer. That's number one. Another thing is that the turntable. Let's go to the turntable now. Back in those days in 1970, the main record, the main turntable was not a turntable. It was a record player. This allowed it to have 78, 45, and 33. It was able to put more than 4 or 5 records on it because the middle of the spindle had a long pin, a hanger pin that allowed you to auto eject. So that meant that when the record got to the groove, that meant that it would go from the needle would go from that end of the groove to all the way to the arm, and then from the arm, our next record would drop down, and then it would go off. It would go to the next thing.
20 seconds, brother.
Okay, in order for you not to have that type of thing, you would have to pay at least, back in those days, maybe $300 or $400 for a TAC turntable. The TAC turntable only allowed one record to be played at a time. One record. Okay, so now let's go back to the breaks. If these breaks were being played, you would have to, number one, pick up the needle because you were not spinning back on a Gerard turntable. You were not, because number one, they did have a band, but it was mostly direct drive. Those when the belt drives came out, it was more easy to put a scalp on there and spin the record back. So for saying that in 1973 that someone had 2 turntables and was mixing records back to back, it's like that. It really doesn't sound like it was like that's what was happening.
Okay,
If this was happening, they would have had some kind of device to do that. Now, I know, because I'm a DJ, I know what was being used, and what was being used at that time was a Sansui receiver. And this allowed you to go from phono 1 to phono 2, or phono 1 and auxiliary. And now that meant that you could take one record and you could play that record, and then you could hold the needle, because you had to hold it You could not let it spin. You had to hold it. And when that record came off, you have to take one hand and turn it to auxiliary or phono 2, let the record go, and that's how it would go. So those were the breaks.